Not every battle is fought on the battlefield. Some take place in silence where there are no gunshots, only prejudice, abuse of power, and the heavy weight of silence forced upon the innocent. But when one ordinary woman dared to say no, an entire system that thought itself untouchable began to unravel. This isn't fiction. This is a true story about a wife, a former Special Forces operative, and a storm of justice that started right on her own front porch. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. We'd love to see where you're tuning in from around the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because stories like this you won't want to miss. That morning began like any other. I stood on the front porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, slippers on my feet, my mind still foggy with sleep when the scene before me froze everything inside me. An HOA officer, yes, from the neighborhood association, suddenly pulled out a taser and fired it straight at my wife. Yes, my wife, Eliza Ward, the woman I love and respect, now lay sprawled across our driveway while a man in a knockoff police jacket screamed into his walkie-talkie like he'd just breached a war zone. What he didn't know and probably never imagined was that Eliza used to be in Special Forces, and her old team. They were already in place on rooftops, behind the side fence, crouched low behind hedges near the gate, red laser dots from their scopes trained squarely on his chest. But Eliza didn't flinch. She'd seen this coming. She let it happen, because she doesn't blink in the face of wannabe tyrants who believe a fake badge makes them untouchable. As for me, I was so shocked I nearly dropped my coffee. Just minutes before, we'd been arguing about whether we had enough charcoal for the weekend barbecue, and now she was lying there motionless. And I didn't even know if I should call 911 or call in an actual tactical response team. We had only lived in Greenbrier Estates for about 6 months, a neighborhood advertised as serene, secure, and family-friendly. But right from the beginning, Eliza gave a skeptical smile. The perfectly trimmed lawns, the matching houses, the rulebook thicker than a military field manual, none of it fooled her. She'd seen worse dressed in more polite clothing. Then came the first incident, her matte black military Jeep. One of its wheels barely grazed the edge of the lawn, and by morning we received a citation that looked like it came straight from a federal security agency. I laughed. Eliza didn't. She scanned the paper, said nothing, and quietly filed it into a folder she labeled Greenbrier Absurdities. At the center of it all was Karenette, the HOA president. Her name sounded like satire, but her presence was no joke. With a rotating wardrobe of pastel sweaters, a clipboard always under one arm, and a permanent scowl reserved especially for Eliza, she ruled like a suburban dictator. "You give off aggressive energy," she once told Eliza. "You're too masculine, too intimidating." Eliza didn't argue. She just smiled, nodded, and went back to adjusting her Jeep's suspension like she hadn't heard a thing. That's when the inspections began: weekly notices, surprise walk-bys, and bizarre citations like combat vehicle disruption and invasive off-road aesthetics. But the real madness came when the HOA announced a new initiative, the Greenbrier Civil Enforcement Division. It sounded official, but it was anything but. 5 men, middle-aged, beer-bellied, sunburned, dressed in camouflage pants and black polos that read Code Enforcer. They patrolled the cul-de-sacs with oversized flashlights, clipboards, pepper spray, and all the misplaced confidence of men who had never seen real authority but desperately wanted to feel it. One afternoon, I saw one of them practicing baton drills next to a rose bush like he was prepping for a hostage rescue. Eliza just watched, quiet, unreadable. She began taking longer walks. At night, I caught glimpses of her wiring something in the attic. "Just observing," she said, when I asked. "They're not ready yet." I didn't push. When Eliza was watching, you let her watch. That's how she won wars without making a sound. Meanwhile, the HOA's amateur task force grew bolder. They installed cameras on stop signs. They fined kids for sidewalk chalk. They cited an elderly woman for rebellious garden gnomes, one of which was flipping the bird. They treated it like domestic terrorism. And still, Eliza didn't flinch. She observed, documented, prepared. Because deep down she knew when you let false power build unchecked, it eventually implodes. The boiling point came quietly. One afternoon, I caught one of the code enforcers leaning too close to our living room window, clipboard in hand, face pressed against the glass. He wasn't inspecting. He was invading. Alisa didn't scream. She didn't even raise her voice. She stepped out calmly, stood 3 feet from him, and asked in a level tone, "Would you like to test your pepper spray against someone who's been tear-gassed more times than you've had hot meals?" He stumbled back like she'd hit him with a baton of her own. But even that didn't stop them. They kept coming: random inspections, phantom citations, drones flying low over our backyard. Alisa began receiving grainy footage from neighbors, clips of confrontations, fines over nonsense, whispers of "you're not alone." Her war room once just a file folder grew. And so did the resistance. Alisa's old team scattered across states began checking in. Quietly, no weapons. Just presence, just eyes. Meanwhile, Coronet strutted through the neighborhood like a queen in denial. Her clipboard was her crown. Her HOA minions, knights with plastic swords. But the kingdom was rotting beneath her. And then came the final straw. Sidewalk chalk. Children had drawn rainbows, stars, and unicorns on the pavement. Wholesome. Harmless. But not to the HOA. The next morning, parents awoke to $100 fines and citations for unauthorized public messaging. Alisa didn't say a word. She simply opened her folder, added the violation to her growing archive, and said one sentence: calm, cold, final. "It's time." That evening, the air smelled like charcoal and anticipation. We were hosting a neighborhood barbecue, burgers sizzling on the grill, classic rock humming from a Bluetooth speaker, kids chasing each other with sparklers. Alisa had parked her Jeep directly under the HOA sign, the flag on her windshield catching the twilight like a quiet dare. She wasn't smiling. She was waiting. Right on cue, the task force arrived. Tactical vests, citation books, sunglasses at dusk. The one in charge, same guy from the Gnome incident, began narrating into his bodycam like he was leading a breach into enemy territory. "Subject identified, non-compliant Jeep preparing to issue citation," he muttered, unaware he was walking into his own reckoning. Alisa didn't move. She stood by the grill, flipping a burger like nothing had changed. They marched toward her with that same smug air they always carried until one of them, clearly feeling brave, pulled out a taser. "This is your last warning," he barked, puffing his chest. Alisa turned toward him slowly. "You'll have to go through me," she said, her voice low, even. The man smirked and pulled the trigger. Click. Spark. Collapse. Alisa dropped like a stone. The laughter died instantly. For a moment, the world froze. Then it lit up: red dots, dozens of them, dancing across tactical vests and confused faces. From the hedges, rooftops, even the alley behind us, crimson lasers targeted every limb, every movement. Alisa's old team had been watching all along. The taser-wielding officer stammered. One dropped his clipboard. Another's jaw went slack as Alisa rolled onto her side, pulled the wires from her chest, and calmly sat up. "I always wondered what it'd feel like to be stunned by a rookie," she said, brushing grass off her pants. Then, with military precision, she stood, reached behind her for a thick folder, and stepped forward. "Everything's been documented," she announced, voice clear, eyes unblinking. "Citations, fines, surveillance footage, wiretaps, impersonation of authority, every last detail submitted to the Department of Justice." At that moment, a man in a navy suit stepped through the crowd. He held up a badge, his voice calm but resolute. "Agent Walker, Dodge Office of Civil Enforcement. We've been monitoring Greenbrier since February, and today we've seen enough." Gasp rippled across the lawn. Walker turned to the taser-happy officer, who was now visibly shaking. "You're under arrest for assault and impersonating federal law enforcement." Before the man could speak, 2 plainclothes agents stepped forward and cuffed him. Another officer tried to protest. "We're just HOA." "You're not law," Walker snapped. "Your charter expired 16 months ago. You've collected over $100,000 in illegal fines. That's not HOA business. That's federal fraud." Then, like a final act in a perfectly orchestrated opera, Coronet arrived, flanked by her board members, still wearing her pastel sweater like armor. "This is a private matter," she screeched. Walker didn't blink. "You authorized the formation of an unregulated enforcement group. You weaponized power. And you did so without legal standing." Alisa stepped forward, handed him another folder. "Emails, financial records, whistleblower statements," she said. "And this proof of charter expiration." Caronet's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Walker didn't need to say another word. The agents flanked her. The clipboard dropped from her fingers. By nightfall, Greenbrier Estates was quiet, eerily so. No more patrols, no more fines. Just stunned silence and neighbors who looked around like they were seeing their street for the first time in years. And Elisa? She was already packing up the grill, tossing burger grease and tyranny into the same bin like it was just another Saturday night cleanup. Within just a week after that unforgettable incident, everything at Greenbrier Estates had shifted in ways no one ever expected. The community boards filled with compliance policies were quietly taken down. Those who once barked orders about order and discipline now avoided eye contact with neighbors, as if their own voices might betray them. The HOA office, once the command center for absurd fines like improper flag angle or unauthorized shine on dog collars, sat closed and abandoned. Inside, clipboards lay forgotten, their authority now as flimsy as the paper they were printed on. Elisa said nothing. She continued her morning walks, headphones in, a calm jazz tune following her steps. But everyone who passed her knew she was the reason things returned to their rightful place. Not through shouting, not through brute force, but with patience, strategy, and a team that worked silently behind the scenes, people who understood that sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. Neighbors who once whispered in fear now chatted freely on their lawns. Children drew rainbows and dinosaurs in chalk again, this time without fear of aesthetic violations. An elderly man who'd once been fined for having 3 cats received a box of pate from the family next door. The fragments of community once choked by fear were beginning to breathe again. At an emergency neighborhood meeting, someone nominated Elisa for HOA president. She shrugged. "If no one else wants the job, I'll stand in for now." No fanfare, no applause. Just one sentence that made the entire room nod in agreement. Rules don't build community. Respect does. Her first official act. Shred the old HOA handbook. Her second. Ban all fines, patrols, and vests in any self-appointed task force. From now on, she said, we'll live with transparency, dialogue, and trust, not fear. As the meeting ended, Mr. Jim from House 12 slowly raised his hand. For the first time in 5 years, he said, "I feel like I actually live in a neighborhood." Elisa gave a soft smile, then turned away. In her hand was a clipboard labeled Civil Enforcement Division. Without hesitation, she tossed it into the still burning fire pit from last week's barbecue. The flames danced, and the backyard filled with laughter, not mocking or forced, but light, honest, and free. By the next morning, Greenbrier Estates felt new, but not in a loud or revolutionary way. It was in the small things. A boy riding his scooter without fear of being stopped. A couple painting their mailbox red without expecting a warning. A grandmother planting sunflowers along her fence, humming as she worked. The HOA was officially dissolved a week later. All outstanding fines were voided. The self-proclaimed task force disbanded. No more surprise visits. No more drones. The tension that once wrapped itself around the community like barbed wire had finally loosened. And Elisa? She never sought credit. Never gave interviews. When asked how she managed to turn an entire system inside out, she only said, "Sometimes you don't need to fight fire with fire. You just need to stop giving it oxygen." But for those who lived through it, her presence would never be forgotten. The calm in her walk, the precision in her silence, the quiet resistance that spoke louder than any protest. What started as a moment of humiliation became a lesson for an entire town. Power without respect invites ruin, and real leadership, it doesn't flaunt itself, it protects, listens, and when necessary, dismantles. Now, neighbors greet each other with a little more warmth. Front porches see more gatherings than violations. And somewhere, deep in the ashes of that clipboard, a lesson still glows. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly. But when it arrives, it leaves no doubt that it's here to stay. A week, then 2 passed since Elisa Ward stood before the entire neighborhood and casually tossed the infamous clipboard into the flames. But even though the fire had died down, its echo lingered like warm embers buried beneath quiet soil. In Crescent Pines, a neighborhood once run like a military outpost, life found a gentler rhythm. No more violation slips on doors. No more watchful glares when someone parked an inch too far from the curb. And the kids? They were back to drawing unicorns, stars, and even aliens on the sidewalks without fearing fines for aesthetically inappropriate chalk use. People started talking to each other again, not through warning letters or HOA group chats, but real conversations in backyards, over dinner, or during early morning coffee. Alisa never called herself a hero. She still went on her morning runs, still waved politely to neighbors, still adjusted the sprinkler system, as if she hadn't just dismantled an entire crooked system. But everyone knew without her, no one would have dared to start. No one else had the patience, discipline, and unshakable belief in justice to see it through. She hadn't used a megaphone. She didn't need to shout. She led with quiet resolve. At one corner of the park, right where it had all started, residents quietly placed a small wooden sign. It had just 3 lines. Justice doesn't grow from fear. It begins with one who dares to stand. Thank you, Alisa. There were no parades, no medals, just nods of gratitude when she passed, and hugs that felt warmer than any summer that ever graced Crescent Pines. What Alisa had sparked wasn't just a rebellion against a rogue HOA. It was a shift in the way the community understood itself. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The local city council, under pressure from the wave of attention, launched a broader review of neighborhood governance policies across the county. It turned out Crescent Pines wasn't alone. Other communities had long suffered in silence, bullied by overreaching neighborhood boards with too much power and too little accountability. Alisa was invited reluctantly at first to speak at a regional forum on civil oversight. She stood behind the podium in a modest blouse and jeans, no notes in hand, no rehearsed speech. Just the truth. I didn't take down a system because I wanted to, she said calmly. I did it because no one else would. And when you live in a world where sidewalk chalk becomes a threat and garden gnomes are criminalized, it's not a question of law, it's a question of values. The room was silent. Even the officials who had once dismissed the Crescent Pines story as isolated sat still, listening. And from that forum came change. By the end of the month, a new county-wide regulation was passed. All HOA rules must be made public, reviewed annually by residents, and could not enforce citations without third-party validation. Every HOA president was required to attend mandatory leadership ethics training. None of these changes bore Alisa's name, but everyone knew who made them happen. Back home, life continued. People stopped Alisa to say thank you. Some shared their own stories. Others just smiled. And in every smile, every whispered thank you, there was something Alisa understood deeply. This wasn't a victory for her. It was a victory for all those who had ever felt small in front of a clipboard. Time moved on. The days in Crescent Pines became longer, lighter, less tense. The air that once buzzed with the static of surveillance and subtle fear now carried the sound of children laughing, neighbors chatting over fences, and sprinklers rhythmically clicking in the evening sun. Alisa Ward never claimed credit. She never gave interviews, never reposted articles that called her the woman who dismantled a dictatorship in a cul-de-sac. She wasn't interested in recognition. Her justice had already been served in full, but the ripples remained. Former members of the so-called task force faded into the background, some quietly relocating, others attending mandated community service as part of their plea agreements. The whole board dissolved, its name now only whispered as a cautionary tale for other neighborhoods daring to toe the line between structure and tyranny. As for Alisa, she resumed her life with the same quiet purpose that had defined her from the beginning. Morning runs, weekend grilling, the occasional smirk when she passed the scorched stump where the clipboard had once been tossed. People still stopped her at grocery stores, post offices, town hall meetings. "You gave us our neighborhood back," they'd say. And she'd always answered the same way with a soft smile, "No. We just remembered how to take care of each other." That's the thing about real power, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't stomp or shout or demand. It simply shows up calmly when it's most needed. And sometimes it wears sneakers and carries a grocery list. At the entrance of Crescent Pines, where once stood a cold iron sign listing bylaws and curfews, a new plaque was installed by unanimous vote. It read, "Freedom is not enforced, it is lived." And it starts with one person who refuses to be quiet. Alisa never looked for justice in noise. She found it in truth and precision, in standing firm, while the world waited for someone else to act. And when the world finally listened, it listened to her. In the years that followed, Crescent Pines became more than just a neighborhood, it became a symbol, a case study, a turning point. Universities invited guest speakers to discuss the HOA uprising. Civil liberties groups cited the incident in national conversations. And once in a while, A quiet woman in a navy windbreaker would sit in the back row of a town hall, sipping coffee, listening not because she had something to prove, but because she understood how quickly comfort could turn into complacency. The world outside moved on. But inside Crescent Pines, something had shifted permanently. Children now drew chalk rainbows freely. Families no longer feared the knock of a clipboard. And barbecues, they became not just events but celebrations of a shared promise: never again. One evening, as the sun melted into amber and laughter echoed down the block, Elisa Ward walked alone past the old HOA office, now converted into a free lending library. She paused at the steps, fingers grazing the brass handle before pulling the door gently open. Inside, instead of regulations, there were books, flyers, and a small framed photograph hung quietly near the door. It showed a woman standing in front of a black Jeep, arms folded, eyes unwavering, with the HOA sign looming behind her. No plaque, no inscription. Just a moment frozen in defiance, preserved in quiet power. Elisa stared at it for a moment, not out of nostalgia, but out of clarity. That wasn't the moment she fought back. That was the moment the system realized it had underestimated the wrong person. And perhaps that is the true moral. When you strip away the noise, the uniforms, the paper rules, and fake power, you're left with people. And some people, when pressed, don't just resist. They rebuild. Elisa closed the door behind her and kept walking. Because her fight was never about revenge. It was about remembrance. About reminding a forgotten community what dignity looked like. And making sure that when history returned to her doorstep, it would find a neighborhood ready to meet it with eyes open, feet planted, and a soul unshaken. Every action in this story, no matter how small, echoed because it was rooted in justice. What made this story powerful wasn't the drama, but the quiet persistence and clarity of a seemingly ordinary person facing a deeply flawed system. What are your thoughts on this story? In your opinion, what needs to change so that stories like this are no longer necessary? Share your perspective and take a guess. By the year 2050, how far will we have come? Will stories like this still need to be told? Don't hold back, because every word we speak today is a step toward the future we want. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.